A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Chapter 1. Bar Humbug. Marley was dead. He had been dead for 7 years now. Did Scrooge know this? Of course he did. Ebenezer Scrooge was Marley's business partner, and he was his only friend. He was, after all, the only one, apart from the undertaker, who went to Marley's funeral. What kind of man was Scrooge, then? Well, if you could think of the coldest weather or the iciest wind, you might be able to imagine the man. The weather itself had no effect on him. Rather, it was the cold inside that froze everything about him. His lips, his nose, his cheeks, his eyes, his lips, his voice, especially his voice, and even his walk. And nobody was meaner than Scrooge. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" Once upon a time, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his office. It was cold, nasty weather, and the fog was thick. The city clocks had just rung 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day, and candles were burning in the windows. The door of Scrooge's office was open so that he might keep an eye on his clerk, who was busy copying letters by a small flame. This was because Scrooge was so mean that he kept the coal in his own room. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, a warm and handsome man who had come to invite his uncle to a Christmas party. "Bah!" said Scrooge. "Humbug!" "Christmas a humbug, Uncle?" said Scrooge's nephew. "You don't mean that, I am sure." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas! You are too poor to be merry." "And you are too rich not to be," said his nephew. "What is Christmas," said Scrooge, "but a time for paying bills and a time for finding yourself a year older? I do not need Christmas, and Christmas does not need me. Keep Christmas in your own way, and let me keep it in mine." "Keep it?" repeated Scrooge's nephew. "But you don't keep it." "Leave me it alone, then," said Scrooge. "Why be so happy? Christmas hasn't ever made you any money." "There are many things in this world that are good, but not money-making," replied the nephew. "And Christmas is one of them. It is a kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time, the only time in the year when men and women open their closed hearts and think of others. And so, Uncle, though Christmas has never made me any money, I believe that it has done me good, and will do me good, and I say God bless it." An applause was heard in the next room. "Let me hear another sound from you," barked Scrooge to his clerk, "and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your position." "Don't be angry, Uncle. Come, have dinner with us tomorrow." "Don't be so foolish," said Scrooge. "Why can you not be happy for once and join us?" asked Scrooge's nephew. "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "I am sorry with all my heart to see you so cold-hearted, but I have made the effort because I believe it is worth it, and I'll keep my Christmas spirit to the end. So, a Merry Christmas, Uncle." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "And a Happy New Year." "Good afternoon," repeated Scrooge. As soon as Scrooge's nephew left the office, 2 gentlemen holding books and papers walked in. "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe?" said one of them, looking at his list. "Do I have the pleasure of speaking with Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" "Mr. Marley died 7 years ago, this very night," Scrooge replied. "Oh, I am truly sorry to hear that, Mr. Scrooge," said the other man. "I am not," said Scrooge. "He left me with a load of paperwork." "We are here because we believe that Christmas is a time of giving, and who might need this more than the poor and homeless?" said the first. "Are there no prisons?" asked Scrooge. "Many prisons," said the other. "I'm very glad to hear it," said Scrooge. "But we feel that the poor and homeless should also share in our joy and happiness, and prisons can hardly do that. Because of this, we are raising money for them, and would very much like people to help. Perhaps you too would like to help." "Gentlemen," replied Scrooge, "I do not help people who cannot help themselves. If the poor are poor, it is for a reason. Now, good afternoon, gentlemen, and please close the door on your way out." Having little hope that Scrooge would change his mind, the gentleman left. The fog, meanwhile, had thickened. Night had fallen on the world outside. The cold outside became so intense that people started lighting fires in the streets. The brightness of the shops, whose windows were decorated with holly, made cold faces reddish as they passed. The carol singers were out, their voices heard full of happiness. One of these stopped outside Scrooge's office, but at the sound of, "God bless you, merry gentlemen!" "I've had enough!" Scrooge slapped his ruler with such a noise, bang, that the young voice left screaming. At last, closing time came in the office. A smile came across the clerk's face as he blew out his candle and put his hat on. "You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose," said Scrooge. "It is Christmas, sir, and it only comes once a year," said the clerk. "A poor excuse. You'd better be here even earlier the next morning," said Scrooge. The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out complaining. After locking up the office, the clerk made his way home to Camden Town, dancing merrily on the snow as he thought about spending Christmas with his family. Chapter 2. Remember My Words. Scrooge had his sad dinner in his usual sad tavern. Once he had finished it and read all the papers, he made his way home. Scrooge lived in the same house which had once belonged to Marley. It was a nasty old place where no normal person would like to live. Now, you must believe that there was nothing very special about the knocker that hung on the door, except that it was very large. You must also believe that Scrooge had seen it night and day, when he came back from work and when he went to work. As soon as Scrooge put his key in the door, the knocker seemed to change before his very eyes. Not a knocker, but Marley's face. Marley's face! It was not an angry face, but looked at Scrooge as Marley used to, with ghostly glasses on his ghostly forehead. The hair was strangely wavy, the eyes wide open, and the colour bluish. It was horrible. But as Scrooge fearfully stared at it, the face changed back into the knocker again. Scrooge quickly turned the key, walked in, and shut the door with a bang. As he lit his candle, Scrooge turned to see if the screws that held the knocker were in the right place. They were. He walked hurriedly across the hall, up the stairs to his room, and double-locked his own door. Sitting room, bedroom, all as it should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa. A small fire in the fireplace, spoon and basin ready, and the little saucepan of porridge on the cooker. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging on the wall. Quite satisfied, Scrooge took off his tie, put on his dressing gown and slippers and his nightcap, and sat down in front of the fire to eat his porridge. He couldn't stop thinking of old Marley. "Humbug," said Scrooge as he finished. After carefully looking around the room with his short eyes, he noticed an old disused bell that hung in the room. With rising fear, he saw that the bell began to swing, left, right, left, right. It swung so softly that it hardly made a sound, but soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. And although this may have lasted half a minute or a minute, it seemed like an hour. The bells stopped as soon as they begun, together, and from deep down in the house came a metallic noise, as if some person were pulling a heavy chain. Somewhere in the house a door flew open with a bang. The noise grew louder and louder and louder still on the floors below. It slowly came up the stairs and was coming straight towards his door. "It's humbug still," said Scrooge. "I won't believe it." The colour in his face changed, though, when the ghostly form of a man came through the heavy door and passed into the room before his very eyes, now facing him. "I know him," cried Scrooge. "Marley's ghost!" The same face, the very same, but with a handkerchief wrapped around his head and chin. Was it keeping his jaw from falling down? Marley in his pigtail, usual waistcoat, tights and boots. The chain he was pulling was tied around his waist. It was long and made of cash boxes, keys and steel padlocks. His body was transparent. Scrooge could still not believe his eyes, even with Marley's death-cold eyes fixed on him. "What do you want with me?" said Scrooge. "Much!" Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you, then?" said Scrooge, raising his voice. "There's something familiar about you." "In life I was your partner, Jacob Marley," said the ghost. "You don't believe in me?" "I don't," said Scrooge. At this, the spirit made a frightful cry, and shook its chain with such a noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling. But how much greater was his horror when the spirit, taking off the bandage round its head, dropped its jaw upon its chest. Scrooge fell upon his knees and held his hands before his face. "Mercy!" he cried. "Oh, why are you haunting me?" "I have come for you," said the ghost. "I have come to warn you." "Warn me? About what?" said Scrooge. "Here, look," said the ghost, pointing to the chain around him. "I made this chain. I made it when I was alive, and I made it from my greed and my selfishness. Do you not recognize its cash boxes?" "Jacob," begged Scrooge. "Old Jacob Marley, tell me more. Speak to me of a bright future, Jacob." "There is none," the ghost replied. "I can only tell you that you too will carry your own chain if you do not change. I am trapped myself, trapped forever. No rest, no peace, and nobody to share my troubles with. All happiness gone, forever and ever." "But you were always a good businessman, Jacob," said Scrooge. "Business?" cried the ghost. "Charity, mercy, and love should have been my business, Ebenezer." "Hear me," said the ghost. "My time is nearly gone, but yours is just beginning. You will be haunted by 3 spirits." "I cannot," said Scrooge. "Without their visits," said the ghost, "you cannot change your future, and you cannot become a better man. The first will come tomorrow at 1 o'clock. The second on the next night at the same time. The third on the next night as soon as you hear the last stroke of 12. Be prepared, Ebenezer, and remember my words. The spirit then folded his handkerchief about his head and walked backwards, and with every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the ghost reached it, the window was wide open. And then it was gone. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double-locked, as he had locked it with his own hands. He tried to say humbug, but stopped himself halfway. And as he was completely exhausted, it had not, after all, been a regular day, Scrooge went straight to bed, without taking his clothes off, and very quickly went to sleep. Chapter 3. And You Shall Fly With Me. When Scrooge woke, it was so dark that, looking out of bed, he could not see his window. He was trying to focus his eyes on certain objects in his room when the bells of a nearby church started to ring. Suddenly remembering what Marley's ghost had told him, he listened for the hour, counting. The clock rang 12. He still, thankfully he thought, had 1 hour. So he got out of bed and crawled to the window. He had to rub the frost off with the sleeve of his dressing gown before he could see anything. Even now he could only see that it was still very foggy, and it was still very cold. Scrooge went back to bed, and thought and thought and thought. Marley's ghost bothered him. He could hardly believe that anyone, and not just anyone, for, as you know, Marley had been dead for 7 years, would come to see him in good faith. So his mind twisted and turned, and he thought that it could easily have just been a dream. At least he hoped it had been a dream. Ding dong, rang the bell. 1:15, said Scrooge, counting. Ding dong, 1:30, said Scrooge. Ding dong, 1:45, said Scrooge. Ding dong. 1 o'clock, and still nothing, Scrooge said joyfully. He spoke too soon. When the last bell rang out, a light instantly flashed up in the room, and the curtains of his bed were drawn. They were drawn by a hand. Scrooge was now face to face with another spirit, but a different one to Marley's. It was a strange figure, like a child. Its hair, which hung around its neck and down its back, was white like an old man's, but the face had not a wrinkle on it, and it shone with youthful colour. The arms were very long and strong, the hands the same. Its legs and chest were bare, but it wore a coat of the purest white. It also held some fresh green holly in its hand. But the strangest thing about it was that from the top of its head there flashed a bright, clear light, which lit all before it. "Are you the spirit who has come to help me?" asked Scrooge, with fear in his voice. "I am." The voice was soft and gentle. "Who and what are you?" Scrooge demanded. "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Whose past?" asked Scrooge. "Your past," said the ghost. "But why?" asked Scrooge nervously. "Because you must understand your past if you are to change your future." The ghost put out its strong hand as it spoke, and took him gently by the arm. "Rise and walk with me." Scrooge rose, but finding that the spirit was walking towards the window, held his dressing gown tightly. I'm human," Scrooge argued, "and I am in danger of falling." "Put your hand in mine," said the ghost, "and you shall fly with me." As these words were spoken, they went through the wall and stood on an open country road with fields on either side. The city had entirely disappeared. The darkness and the fog had disappeared too, and it was a clear, cold, wintry day with snow on the ground. "Good heaven!" said Scrooge as he looked around him. "I was brought up in this place. I was a boy here." Scrooge suddenly noticed 1,000 childhood smells hanging in the air, each one reminding him of thoughts and hopes and joys long, long forgotten. They walked along the road until a little market town appeared in the distance, with its bridge, its church, and its own river. Ponies were seen galloping towards them with boys on their back, shouting cheerfully in the fresh air. As they went round a bend, they came up to a large brick building that Scrooge remembered as a school. "The school is not quite empty," said the ghost. "A child, forgotten by his friends, is still there." Scrooge said he knew it, and a tear fell from his eye. The ghost and Scrooge walked in and across the hall, to a door at the back of the building. It opened before them as they walked in. The room was long and empty, made emptier still by lines of wooden desks and chairs. At one of these, a lonely boy was reading by a small fire, and Scrooge sat down upon a chair and cried to see himself as he used to be. "I wish," said Scrooge, "but it's too late now." "What is the matter?" asked the spirit. "Nothing," said Scrooge. "Nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should have given him something, that's all." The ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved its hand, saying, "Let us see another Christmas." Scrooge and the ghost again stood side by side in the open air. "I have little time," said the spirit. "Quick." Scrooge again saw himself, but he was older now, a healthy young man. His face did not have the hard and stiff lines that he was to have later on in his life, but it had begun to show what was to trouble him later: greed and selfishness. He was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young girl in a black dress. The girl had been crying as her eyes were watery with tears. "You once loved me, Ebenezer, but that love is gone now. You don't need me any more. All you need is money." "But there's nothing worse in this lonely world of ours than to be poor," said Scrooge. "There is," replied the girl, "a world without love." "But love alone does not put food on our table," said Scrooge thoughtfully. "You fear the world too much," she answered gently, "which is why, with a full heart, I have to let you go. You have decided your future, and you do not need me with you. May you be happy in the life you have chosen." She walked away from him. Scrooge wanted to call out to her, wanted to hold her, wanted to be with her for ever and ever. But the ghost explained to him that these were just memories, shadows of a world that had been. "Please take me home," cried Scrooge. "Is it not enough that I have seen my heart break again?" At this, the spirit burned with light and Scrooge was aware of being exhausted and back in his bedroom, of being in his own bed. He instantly fell into a heavy sleep, dreaming of his younger self.